You might have seen these images before, and they are typically discarded as brain rot images. But I'm convinced that's not the case, that they actually have some real meaning behind them, and I have recruited ChatGPT to get to the bottom of this problem. So here I'm going to read you the description, the real meaning that these images actually have. So the Dolphin man that you are seeing here represents how capitalism strips people of their identity, turning them into something weird and marketable just to survive. The mix of human and non-human features shows how workers lose their individuality and are forced to fit into roles that make them more useful to the system. Like an employee faking a smile while being exploited, this face looks both unsettling and fake, the existential horror of being commodified. The one-eyed man reflects the warped reality of the modern information landscape, where individuals are expected to see everything while being denied true vision. The single eye, exaggerated and central, symbolizes the illusion of awareness in a system designed to keep people blind to their own exploitation. This human-pig hybrid, which goes by the name of John Pork, is smiling in front of an old castle, which embodies the grotesque fusion of wealth and obliviousness. The contented elite who revel in their privileges while others toil. The pig, long a symbol of greed and gluttony, is merged with human form, blurring the line between the oppressor and the system that shapes them. The unsettling smile suggests a willful ignorance, a creature at peace in its distorted existence, blind to the decay around it. So this is actually the true meaning of these images. No, I'm just kidding. They're very likely just brain rot, something which really doesn't have any meaning behind it. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that our brains and now these large language models can easily find meaning and find explanations and justifications for everything in ways that are most likely very far away from the actual intention or meaning of the work. And this is a problem because you can argue that when something is too open to interpretation, then it loses its value because to some extent it cannot be grounded in anything. So if something can mean anything, then from the point of view of language, it becomes stripped of its value because you cannot properly communicate it. You cannot ground it into any sort of definition, and therefore you cannot really have any discussion about it. Additionally, as you might know, the human brain is always trying to find patterns in everything. It is how we were able to survive. By finding patterns and being able to predict what is going to happen in your environment is a crucial aspect of survival. But the human brain can also very easily find patterns where they don't exist. And this is where the term apophenia really comes into, which is the act of finding meaning in everything, drawing connections between everything where there really isn't any concrete meaning there. Of course, here you can get very philosophical. You can argue that meaning is created and therefore there is no actual tangible and inherent meaning to be detected. But as I illustrated with the brain rot images, you can basically do this for everything. And this inability to constrain our interpretive model and actually draw conclusions that are more relevant and pertinent is one of the trademarks in schizophrenia, where some people essentially find meaning and connections between everything. For example, if they're watching a commercial and the actor in the commercial blinks their eye, they might assume that that blink was directed precisely at them, and the meaning of that ad was precisely constructed to arrive at them. Additionally, we are also very prone to excessive allegorization. And what this means is that we tend to draw also very symbolic and abstract meanings from works of art or texts that perhaps completely misrepresent the author's intention and view of their work. And this is a criticism that is often made towards Jordan Peterson by Sam Harris and other people, where they argue that what Jordan Peterson is doing is just imposing a sort of framework for meaning that you can essentially apply to anything. And Sam Harris has that example of, for example, picking up a culinary book and just generating all these sort of teleological meanings from it that you can essentially apply to anything. Because as I showed with the other example, you can basically generate meaning out of anything. So it can be useful to have some guidelines on how we should operate in this direction. When it comes to written and verbal communication, there are some guidelines. There is this field called Hermeneutics, which is essentially trying to establish proper rules for interpreting written or verbal communication. I will leave a link in this video that goes more deeply into what that is, but I just wanted to frame this issue by showing some steps that we must cross to properly derive useful meaning or an explanation. So Aristotle named these three aspects of interpretation, which is you have the Elocutio, which is the actual text which you are reading, you have the Interpretatio, which is your interpretation of the text, and then you have the Explicatio, which is the text of the interpreter. And as we go from one to another, there are always risks because you might completely misrepresent the original message, and so we need some guidelines on how to avoid this. So when it comes to qualitative research, there is this thing called the PEARL framework, which stands for Point Evidence Analysis, Reference, and Link, which is essentially every time when you make a claim, you need to support it with a textual passage and basically ground every one of your arguments in the text. So this is just a basic principle that should apply to everything, right? When we make a claim, we should always cite our sources or at least provide some sort of justification for it. The next one is to apply the Occam's razor principle, right? Because several times the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. So if we can, we should try to keep it simple and try to avoid wild guesses and metaphorical interpretations. A very important one is that most people tell you that you really need to understand the text you are reading. You need to understand the author who is writing that text, and that is absolutely true. But first of all, you must understand yourself, because when you are reading something, when you are experiencing the world, you are essentially projecting your internal world onto the external world. Meaning that your internal biases, your way of seeing the world, your past experiences will greatly affect your perception and interpretation of the text. So doing some sort of introspection, and this can be done, of course, in various different ways, but just working on understanding yourself will also allow you to have a better grasp on your biases and the ways that you tend to interpret text or verbal communication. Another very important aspect of understanding a piece of work is, of course, paying attention to the context of it. So the historical context, the cultural context, basically trying to understand the significance of that work at the time in which it was written. Additionally, when we are reading a text, it's also important to try to understand what is the author's intent. And everything that I'm saying here can somewhat be debated because some people say that once someone writes a book, it stops being theirs, it starts being the reader's book. And so in that respect, the reader does not have any obligation to follow the author's intention. So if you follow that camp, ignore this video, get out of here. But if you care about the author's intention and understanding what the work is actually trying to convey from the author's perspective, it is always important to do some biographical work and understand the context of the author's life and also read past works, because it is the prior work which builds up to the work you are reading right now. Another important aspect is to try and be consistent with your interpretations. So something which for me is frustrating is when people are interpreting the Bible, they tend to cherry pick whether the passage is supposed to be interpreted in a literal way or a metaphorical way. And so what some people do is that when the passage seems too harsh, they say that it is supposed to be metaphorical, that you need to get some distance between yourself and the actual words. And other times they just say, okay, now this is supposed to be interpreted literally. And if you're not consistent and coherent with your framework for that sort of interpretation, then basically your interpretation becomes very hard to follow and, in my opinion, loses a lot of its value. And lastly, in terms of these tips, I would say that it is useful to stay as close as possible to the literal meaning of words, because the more you depart from that meaning, the more you are guessing. And of course, there are times where you should get further away and sometimes you should get close. It really depends, like I said, on what is your intention when you are reading that work. Are you trying to understand the author, or are you just trying to generate novel ideas and just exploring the text and seeing what comes up? I would like to draw an analogy between the way our minds work and also how we interact with these large language models and their outputs. So you might have had the experience of, for example, doing some research using ChatGPT, and you're asking it for some sources, or I don't know, you have some other question and you ask it and you find out that the answer is completely wrong, or you find out that the sources which the ChatGPT or another language model is claiming to cite don't really exist. And this goes by the name of large language model hallucination. And the interesting part is that we humans also tend to do the same. When we are unable to extract an answer or an explanation for that which surrounds us, Our brains, since they don't like to not have answers, they don't like uncertainty, they also go through the same process. They generate ideas and propositions about the world that have little to no justification. In fact, when we are trying to understand someone's behavior or our own behavior, our justifications come, of course, after the facts of our behavior. What this means is that we are constructing a story as we go, and the story which we are constructing isn't necessarily a causal link to the behavior that we have committed. So in some sense, you can also view our brains as this narrative making machine, which is making stuff on the go as well. So understanding these principles, I think, are also important when it comes to interpreting the world around us, works from other people, or even interactions when you are communicating and having all sorts of conversations. So let me know if you found this video interesting. Let me know if you disagree with anything I said, and stay tuned for more videos.